Welcome to King's College London. I'm Evelyn Welsh. I'm the Vice Principal for Arts and Sciences, and it's my enormous pleasure to introduce Bill Brewer, the Susan Stebbing Professor of Philosophy, to give one of a number of inaugural lectures that form part of this week's Arts and Humanities Festival, Being Human there. Before introducing Bill, I just wanted to say a little bit about the Susan Stebbing Chair. Susan Stebbing, 1885 to 1943, took her MA at King's College London in the good old days when you could do it between 1911 and 1920. That's how long she took to get her King's MA there. She did a thesis on pragmatism and French voluntarism and became a part-time lecturer at King's between 1913 to 1915 there. An analytic philosopher, she went on to teach at Bedford College. And many of you will remember Bedford was one of the first women's colleges in the University of London. The Stebbing Chair was created in her honour when the Bedford College philosophers, sensibly rather than going to Royal Holloway, decided to join King's there. The importance of this is not only in the honouring of one of Britain's great female philosophers, but also in the wonderful chairs who have held this position before. And Bill follows in an extraordinary line of distinguished individuals, including Professor Richard Sorabji and Professor Mark Sainsbury's, who hold this chair. So Professor Brewer read Maths and Philosophy at Oxford, where he also received a B.Phil and a D.Phil in philosophy. And he was a senior scholar at Oriel College, Oxford, a research fellow at King's College, Cambridge, a tutorial fellow and university lecturer at St. Catherine's College, Oxford. And between 2004 and 2012, he was Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, where he tells me they didn't do inaugural lectures. So you really are getting Bill's inaugural here. He works in the philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and epistemology, and is the author of two extraordinary monographs, Perception and Reason, OUP 1999, and Perception and Its Objects, published again by OUP in 2011, as well as many papers in journals and collections. And a central focus of his arguments concerns the role of material objects as the unified explanatory grounds of the order and nature of our actual and counterfactual perceptual experience of them. Finally, on a more pragmatic ground, I want to let you know that Maria Rosa Antognazza will give the vote of thanks at the end of the lecture, and, as importantly, there will be a reception to which you are all warmly invited in chapters on the first floor. But now, can I invite Professor Brewer to give his inaugural lecture?
Thank you very much indeed, Evelyn, and thank you all for being here. It's a great honour to address you as the Susan Stebbing Professor of Philosophy here at King's. There's been a very fruitful return in recent years to an ordered Aristotelian conception of metaphysics from the flat Quinean conception that dominated much of the 20th century. The goal of flat metaphysics is a simple list of existence. Ordered metaphysics aims instead at an account of fundamental existence, along with the various ways in which everything else may be grounded upon them. My project here is to explore a possible fragment of an Aristotelian metaphysics in this sense. It's a fragment because it concerns the grounding relations only between a subset of existence, very roughly, perceptible macroscopic material things. It's a merely possible metaphysics because the case for its endorsement is at best incomplete. Working out the details is a long-term project. Its central thesis is that amongst persisting macroscopic material objects, there are what I call natural continuants, whose unity at a time and over time is entirely natural and independent of our concepts and activities. Natural continuants ground what I call artificial continuants by partition, collection, and approximation. I call the position the natural continuance view, NCV for short. Section 1 of the lecture offers a provisional characterization of NCV. Section 2 considers a familiar puzzle concerning the idea that material objects may survive the loss of a part in order to provide intuitive motivation for NCV and to elaborate its commitments concerning spatial parts. The result of that is an account of the way in which natural continuants ground some artificial continuants by spatial partition. Sections 3 and 4 of the lecture turn respectively to the grounding of artificial continuants upon natural continuants by temporal partition on the one hand and by collection and approximation on the other. Section 5 concludes with a brief recapitulation of the main claims of NCV before presenting another contrast with the metaphysical vision of Quine. So, section 1 is the natural continuance view. NCV, as I say, claims that there are natural continuants, persisting macroscopic material objects that are wholly naturally unified both at a time and over time. Their being a unified persisting individual is entirely independent of our concepts and activities. They're characterized by the following condition that I call exclusivity. If O and O star are natural continuants, and there's a time at which they precisely occupy the same spatial extent, then O is identical to O star. In other words, no two distinct natural continuants ever occupy precisely the same place at the same time. I take plausible examples of natural continuants to include roughly animals, vegetables, and minerals, though even our best hypotheses as to natural continuant status may be subject to correction in the light of further investigation. So first, there are naturally occurring natural continuants, such as a cat, for example, that's conceived, grows inside its mother, is born, lives an active life, perhaps losing a tail on the way, dies and eventually disintegrates by decomposition. Or an acorn that falls from an oak, sprouts in the ground and grows to become a grand old oak itself that's finally destroyed by the loggers. Or a rock that detaches and falls from a cliff, gradually eroding to become a small pebble and perhaps even a grain of sand on the beach before vanishing altogether. Second, there are also human-made natural continuants, such as a single coin, minted and much used, discarded out of circulation, battered and bent, used as a tool to open tins, and winding up in a museum collection before finally melting away in a fire. So that's the natural continuance. NCV further claims that natural continuants metaphysically ground artificial continuants, as I say, by partition, collection, and approximation. The idea is that artificial continuants are unified at a time and over time on the basis of a more fundamental domain of natural continuants, at least in part by our conceptual delineation. Such derivative unification operates in various ways, including first, the spatial and temporal partitioning of a natural continuant, say by our designation of a subregion of its extent or a temporary role that it plays. Second, our collection of appropriately related or functionally integrated natural continuants at a time or over time. And third, our approximation of the overall behavior of a coordinated assemblage of natural continuants to that of a single such thing. These modes of grounding, by what we might call artificial unification, may also be combined, and they're illustrated and elaborated in what I say to follow. Artificial continuants fail exclusivity, both amongst themselves and with the natural continuants. That's to say, there may be artificial continuants, A and A star, such that there's a time at which they precisely occupy the same spatial extent, yet A is not identical to A star. And there may be an artificial continuant A and a natural continuant O, such that there's a time at which they precisely occupy the same spatial extent, yet A is not identical to O. This is possible in their case, in contrast with the exclusivity characteristic within the natural continuants, because artificial continuants' basic properties are simply derived from their grounding natural continuants, along with their mode of artificial unification. Examples of what I take to be artificial continuants, according to NCV, include arbitrary conceptually delineated spatial parts of natural continuants, such as the whole of Tibbles the cat except for his tail, conceptually delineated temporal parts of natural continuants, such as a lump of clay whilst it's a statue, appropriately related collections of natural continuants, such as a chess set, say, and coordinated assemblages of natural continuants, such as a watch. It's crucial in all these cases, though, to recognise that these are indeed artificial and not natural continuants. For as I illustrate in what follows, failure to respect that distinction is a source of significant error and confusion. Okay, so put some details on that. Sections 2 and 4 now offer further clarification and motivation for NCV by considering a series of familiar and some slightly less familiar metaphysical puzzle cases. So section 2 is quite an extensive section about spatial partition. And I start with a tale that will be very familiar to the philosophers amongst you. Consider the familiar tale of Tibbles. Tibbles is a normal cat with an impressive long tail sitting on a mat. Call the object consisting of all of Tibbles except for his tail, Tib. Suppose that Tibble's tail is removed at time t. Surely Tibbles survives the loss and sits on the mat tailless after t. Equally surely, Tib remains on the mat after t too, for Tib is entirely unaffected by the removal of Tibble's tail. Tib is all of Tibble's except for the tail, so unaffected by the removal of Tibble's tail. It's natural to assume that there's only one thing there on the mat after t, hence Tibble's must be, that is, be identical to Tib. But this cannot be, since Tib was a proper part of Tibble's, that's to say, a part non-identical to it, and so they cannot be identical. Philosophers have responded in almost every possible way to this problem, and I certainly don't propose to engage here in a full exposition and assessment of the relative merits of all the solutions. Instead, I present what strikes me as a perfectly natural alternative to most of them that provides a springboard for the discussion to follow. This is to accept that both Tibbles and Tib exist as persisting material things. Both survive the intervention at t. Tibbles is a naturally unified continuant that excludes any other such thing from its precise spatial extent at any time. Tib, on the other hand, is a dependent entity grounded upon Tibbles by a mode of abstraction involving the concept of a tail complement, that is, all of something except for its tail. Tib's precise coincidence with Tibbles from t is therefore unproblematic, for Tib's basic properties are simply derived from Tibbles by the relevant abstraction. Put in terms of NCV, Tib is an artificial continuant grounded upon the exclusive natural continuant Tibbles by spatial partition. For the remainder of the present section, I attempt to work out the implications of making an adequate and unified solution to the paradox of Tibbles and other similar cases from these NCV intuitions. So the basic thought is that natural continuants constitute the fundamental domain of persisting macroscopic material objects. Their unity in extent is a basic fact of nature, entirely independent of our concepts and activities. As the fundamental persisting macroscopic things, they precisely occupy they precisely occupy their spatial extent exclusively at all times. Artificial continuants may be delineated and unified by conceptual partition, collection, and approximation on the basis of this more fundamental domain. The spatial extent, temporal duration, and material nature of artificial continuants is therefore derived from their grounding natural continuants along with the relevant mode of artificial unification. Hence, they may fail exclusivity both among themselves and with natural continuants. Thus, in the case of spatial partition, artificial continuant Tib becomes precisely yet unproblematically coincident with natural continuant Tibbles at T. NCV regards the status as a natural continuant or as an artificial continuant as essential to the particular object that has it. For the source of their metaphysical unity, both at a time and over time, is quite different in the two cases. And this is important. So Tib does not become a natural continuant when Tibble's tail is removed at T. And the reason it's important is that if Tib did become a natural continuant at T, then either there'd be two distinct yet precisely coincident natural continuants on the mat after T, in contradiction with exclusivity, or else Tib would have to be identified with Tibbles after all, in contradiction with their differing spatial extents before T. Now, consider tail. Tail is the smaller result of Tibble's tail removal at T. I presume that this is a natural continuant, according to NCV, for it's a naturally unified, persisting macroscopic material object, although one that's likely to be significantly outlasted by Tibble's, since unless steps are taken to avoid it, tail will rapidly decompose. Call the object consisting of Tibble's tail before T, Tib prime. Like Tib, I take it that this is an artificial continuant, grounded upon Tibble's and unified by spatial partition, this time on the basis of the concept of a tail. So we may ask where tail comes from and what happens to Tib prime at T, and what explains the basic material nature of tail at that time. Given what I've just said, and this is crucial to the position, the artificial continuant Tib prime does not become the natural continuant tail. Okay, those must be distinct things. So what to say? Well, first, tail is the result of a division of Tibbles. In general, when a natural continuant's divided into two natural continuants, at least one of these is something new. In general, there'll be exceptions later. At least one of these is something new that did not exist before and is created by the division. Both may be new if the natural continuant, the initial natural continuant, is destroyed, as would be the case, for example, if a giant boulder were divided precisely equally into two large rocks. In the current case, though, Tibbles survives tailless, but tail is a new creation by division. Second, what about Tib prime? Well, since Tibbles no longer has a tail after T, Tib prime is destroyed at that time. There is no longer an artificial continuant grounded on Tibbles by tail-based spatial partition. Third, given the way that tail is created by division at T, it has the basic properties that Tib prime has when it's destroyed at that time. These in turn are simply derived from Tibbles by the relevant tail-based abstraction. Thus, for example, tail's length at T plus epsilon is the extent of Tibbles that's included in the spatial partition induced by the concept of a tail at T minus epsilon, which is to say the length of Tib prime at that time. Now, here are the exceptions to the general principle I mentioned above. Over and above such arbitrary artificial continuants as Tib and Tib prime, some of the proper spatial parts of some natural continuants may themselves be natural continuants, whose unity, both at a time and over time, is entirely dependent of our concepts and activities, rather than being mere partition products grounded on metaphysically more fundamental wholes. Plausible candidates for this status are certain organs and individual teeth of animals, say, and the leaves and fruit of certain plants. These lead to exceptions to the principle cited as normal just now, that when a natural continuance divided into two natural continuants, at least one of these is something new that didn't exist and is created by the division. For when my right kidney is removed successfully, say, I survive, as does the natural continuant proper part, that very natural continuant proper part. Neither of them is created anew by the division. But it's straightforward to prove for NCV that a natural continuant may not survive the loss of the complement of any of its natural continuant proper parts, where by complement of a given part, I mean everything but that part. Here's the argument for that. Suppose that P is a natural continuant proper part of a natural continuant O. Suppose for reductio that O may survive the loss at time t of the complement of P, let's call it P prime. That's all of O except for P. Then by the argument given concerning Tibbles, we have a contradiction. For P remains unchanged, precisely coincident with O that survives its reduction in size at t by the loss of P prime. Both O and P are natural continuants, hence O's identical to P by exclusivity, yet O's not identical to P since P is a proper part of O before T. That's a contradiction, so O may not survive the loss of P prime at T. If P prime is destroyed, then all that remains of O is the distinct proper part P, distinct proper part P. O itself is no more. How does this result bear on what I offered above as the most plausible candidates for the status of natural continuant proper parts of natural continuants? That's to say certain organs and teeth of animals, say, and the leaves and fruit of certain plants. Well, an animal does not survive the loss of everything but its right kidney, its heart, or its lower left incisor. If all the rest of the animal's destroyed, then the animal itself is no more. Similarly, an individual plant fails to survive the loss of everything but a single leaf or fruit, even if a distinct new plant of the same kind may be produced by that very fruit. But what about the brain, and in particular the human brain? Here we have to be especially careful, given an inevitable interaction with complex issues concerning personal identity. Still, I think that NCV is in the clear, although I'll have to be quite dogmatic on that here. I'll just explain how the argument would go. Consider first of all a case in which questions of personal identity are beside the point. If all but the brain of a cat's destroyed, then the cat is no more. All that remains is a distinct natural continuant, a brain that was a proper part of the animal that has been destroyed. Ignoring questions of personal identity, I see no reason to think any differently about the case of a human being. If all but the brain is destroyed, then surely the animal itself is no more. All that remains is a distinct natural continuant that was a proper part of the human being that has been destroyed. Things become difficult for NCV only if it conjoins the current admission that a human being's brain is a natural continuant, proper part of the natural continuant animal whole, with two further claims about persons. Put in the first person, these are A, that I am identical to a human animal, and B, that I may survive even if all of me is destroyed except for my brain. The result is that a natural continuant survives the loss of all of itself except for a natural continuant proper part, and we've seen that that's inconsistent with the general NCV strategy in response to cases in which part of an animal is removed. On that strategy, either the animal does not survive the loss, as for example when all of Tibbles except for his tail is destroyed, just leaving a tail, Tibbles is no more, or what remains is not precisely coincident with a natural continuant that was a proper part of the animal, although it may, of course, be precisely coincident with an artificial continuant, proper part, unified by spatial partition, as, for example, when Tybalt's tail is destroyed. This simply shows that the version of NCV currently under consideration should reject the conjunction of A and B. So A was, I'm identical to a human animal, and B was, I may survive, even if all of me is destroyed except for my brain. The issues here are certainly complex and controversial, but the response is surely independently defensible. The basic thought would be that an account of personal identity on which persons are material objects, for which B is true, that's to say for which they may survive, those persons may survive, even if all of them is destroyed except for their brain. That view must identify persons with brains in opposition to the identification in A of persons with whole human animals, of which brains are proper parts. So this version of NCV may again reject, as it must, the possibility that a natural continuant might survive the loss of the complement of any of its natural continuant proper parts. Now, animals certainly may survive the loss of the paradigm examples of their natural continuant proper parts that I offered, a kidney or a single tooth, say. So a version of NCV that embraces these examples must also deny that the complement of any natural continuant proper part of a natural continuant is necessarily itself a natural continuant. For suppose that that principle were correct, and suppose we call all of Tybalt's, except for his lower left incisor, Gappy. It follows that Gappy is a natural continuant since it's the complement of a natural continuant proper part, according to the principle to be reduced to absurdity. Yet Tybalt's may survive the loss of its, that's Gappy's, complement, which is just the incisor. Gappy survives too as a natural continuant, precisely coincident with Tybalt's and hence identical to Tybalt's by exclusivity, yet Gappy was a proper part of Tybalt's and is therefore distinct. We have a contradiction. So the principle that the complement of any natural continuant proper part of a natural continuant is itself a natural continuant must be rejected. Once again, though, I see no good reason to endorse the problematic principle from the point of view of NCV. Suppose that a natural continuant O has a natural continuant proper part P. That's to say P is naturally unified. Its unity, both at a time and over time, is entirely independent of our concepts and activities. Still, the natural unification of a persisting material object that encompasses the complement of P and O, call it P prime, may nevertheless extend to assimilate P, at least while it's there to be so assimilated. If P were to be removed in such a way that O survives, then the very same unification of the surviving natural continuant O would include only what's precisely coincident with artificial continuant P prime. But with P in place, it is naturally included in the unification of O, and there may yet be no natural unification of a persisting material object that excludes precisely P. Put slightly differently, natural boundaries may be asymmetric, since the principles responsible for natural unification may be quite different in the two cases of P and of O. Although those controlling the unification of P may terminate at its boundary, those controlling natural unification within P prime may extend beyond the boundary with P, when P's there, to include this as a proper part of the natural continuant whole, which is O. Thus, the proponent of NCV may reject the principle that the complement of any natural continuant proper part of a natural continuant is necessarily itself a natural continuant. Indeed, rejection of that very principle captures an important sense in which, according to NCV, natural continuants are not in general mere composites of natural continuant proper parts. Okay, so that's spatial partition. I'm going to turn now to another familiar case and consider temporal partition. That's to say the grounding of artificial continuance upon natural continuance by temporal partition. The familiar case apparently threatens the MCV commitment to exclusivity for natural continuance. That's the principle that they are identical if there's any time at which they precisely occupy the same spatial extent. Suppose that a lump of, and very familiar example, suppose that a lump of clay is detached from a large block and sometime later fashioned into a person-shaped statue. The statue stands before me, call it Goliath. The lump is before me too, call it Lumpel. Lumpel existed prior to any sculptural intervention. It's often said that Goliath did not exist prior to sculpting, for there was no statue there then. In that case, Goliath and Lumpel are distinct and both exist in exactly the same region of space before me now. On the assumption that Lumpel and Goliath are natural continuants, then they constitute a counterexample to exclusivity. The response from NCV has two parts, a natural continuant part and an artificial continuant part. First, Lumpel is a natural continuant, existing throughout. It came into existence when detached from a large block and will be destroyed, let's say, when the statue is eventually smashed into pieces. Its shape was slowly, deliberately, painstakingly transformed by the sculptor in accordance with her evolving aesthetic project. Eventually, as the intentional accomplishment of that very plan, it took on the shape, Lumpel took on the shape of a human person. Lumpel, therefore, became a statue. So insofar as Goliath names the natural continuant before me now that satisfies the predicate X is a statue, that's to say the statue itself, then Goliath is just identical to Lumpel. The error in what's often said is to infer from the fact that there was no statue prior to sculpting that the natural continuant before me now that is a statue, namely Goliath, which is identical to Lumpel, did not exist then. That inference is essential to the argument against exclusivity, yet NCV rejects it. Goliath, aka Lumpel, clearly existed before it became a statue. Second, though, we may decide to use the term Goliath quite differently to identify an artificial continuant that's grounded upon Lumpel by temporal partition. That's to say, use it to identify Lumpel whilst it's a statue. This makes essential use of the concept of a statue to pick out a phase of the natural continuant Lumpel, the phase of Lumpel that's delineated by the concept of being a statue. In that case, Goliath is essentially a statue and so must be distinct from Lumpel, for Lumpel existed when there were no statues around. Yet this Goliath is not a natural continuant. It's an artificial continuant articulated and unified by abstraction from a more fundamental basic domain of natural continuance, in particular Lumpel, by appeal to our concept of a statue. Its basic properties are simply derived from those of Lumpel, along with the concept of being a statue. Hence, its temporary coincidence with Lumpel is entirely unproblematic. It just is Lumpel restricted to the statued phase of its existence. As we've already seen in connection with spatial partition, a central thesis of NCV is that failure properly to recognise the distinction between natural and artificial continuance is the source of serious philosophical confusion. Here, it's the false assumption that Goliath is both a natural continuant and essentially a statue that causes the difficulty. We may use the term Goliath to pick out a natural continuant, that very statue before me. This is Lumpel, which only temporarily, and certainly not essentially, is a statue. We may also use the term Goliath to pick out Lumpel whilst it's a statue. This is essentially a statue, for that concept's essential to its unification as an individual. This Goliath is not itself a distinct natural continuant, though. It's not a natural continuant at all, but an artificial continuant grounded on Lumpel by temporal partition. A similar failure to recognise the distinction between natural and artificial continuants is the cause of confusion in the tale of Tibbles. Tibbles survives the loss of a part. Tib is defined in such a way that it's distinct from Tibbles, survives unchanged, and became coincident with Tibbles at T. The assumption then that Tib is of the same metaphysical category as Tibbles himself is therefore inconsistent with the conviction that individuals of that category exclusively occupy their precise extent at all times. Naturally unified, persisting objects exclude other such things from the precise space they occupy at any time. Retaining that intuition and leaving everything else as it is, as in the common sense tale of Tibbles, motivates a distinction in metaphysical categories between Tibbles and Tib. Thus NCV is born. A second case of temporal partition helps to make the transition to my discussion of the final mode of grounding of artificial continuants on natural continuants. That's collection and approximation in section 4, which is shortly to follow. But first, another case of temporal partition. Suppose that I have a note of currency, paper money, in my hand, from an economic system in which payment with paper money is possible if and only if the single serial number on the bottom left-hand corner of the front face is legible. Call this note. Now suppose that the front bottom left-hand corner of note gets damp so that the ink irremediably runs and the serial number is no longer legible. By analogy with the NCV account of Lumpel Goliath, although I no longer have a valid unit of currency in my hand, the natural continuant that previously satisfied the predicate, X is a unit of currency, that very unit itself, namely note, is still there, although it no longer satisfies that predicate. We may also identify an artificial continuant grounded upon note by temporal partition, note whilst it's a unit of currency. Call that cash. Cash is essentially a unit of currency and hence distinct from note, although cash is temporarily coincident with note. This is consistent with exclusivity for natural continuants, since although note is a natural continuant, cash is not. It is an artificial continuant abstracted from note by our concept of a unit of currency. Furthermore, the coincidence is unproblematic because the basic properties of cash are simply derived from those of note by temporal partition on the basis of that concept. Suppose instead that I keep note dry, but I cut it in half. According to NCV, I thereby destroy note and create two new pieces of paper by division. Call these note 1, the half with the serial number on it, and note 1 minus. Like note, and unlike note 1 minus, note 1, that's the half with the serial number on it, is a unit of currency. I may pay for goods with it. Still, note 1 is distinct from note, which is no more. I may go on to create a further succession of units of currency, note 2, note 3, and so on, by repeated cutting until I have a small scrap of paper showing just a serial number. Call it note M. I may still pay for goods with note M in this economic system, a distant descendant of note by division. All the distinct note I's satisfy the predicate X is a unit of currency. We may then identify a collective artificial continuant, call it currency, consisting of the series of units of currency note, note 1, note 2, up to note m. This is grounded upon the distinct note I, natural continuance, by collection on the basis of our interest in what we can and can't use to pay for goods. As I say, I consider collection and approximation shortly in section 4. For present purposes, the key lesson is that in identifying artificial continuants, such as cash and currency, we're absolutely not identifying a single natural continuant that's initially precisely coincident with note, yet must be distinguished from it, because unlike note, it survives successive cutting in half, and yet is destroyed by getting wet. Once again then, the crucial NCV distinction between natural and artificial continuants preserves the exclusivity of natural continuants, consistently with preserving what we might regard as the trajectory over time of their properties and roles that we happen to care about. Okay, so now on to section 4, which is collection and approximation. So far, I've been concerned with the grounding of artificial continuants upon natural continuants by spatial and temporal partition. Given a domain of natural continuants, it's also possible to construct artificial continuants by collection and by approximation. These forms of metaphysical grounding are the topic of this section. Consider to begin with a full set of chess pieces in a box before me. So far as NCV is concerned, what's in the box is a collection of 32 individual natural continuants, each a specifically shaped piece of wood, let's say. Given the context, though, it invites the consideration of at least 3 quite different artificial continuants. Indeed, these may better be thought of as 3 nodes on a web of artificial continuants varying along the 3 dimensions that they highlight. So first of all, there's the simple plurality of precisely those pieces, individuated by the identities of its 32 natural continuant members. This exists at a time, if and only if, all 32 of the pieces before me exist at that time, and it's located at a time where they are then, which may be massively scattered. Second, there's also a distinct artificial continuant, articulated and unified by the near continuous fulfillment over space and time of the salient and intended role of being an appropriately related plurality of pieces suitable for playing chess. Thus a rook amongst those before me now may be lost and replaced by a plastic piece. A pawn may be replaced by a coin. One of the wooden bishops may be dropped and destroyed, splitting into many pieces, one of which, the small base portion, is retained for use as a distinct descendant bishop in future games, and so on. This artificial continuant is a collection over times of pluralities of pieces fulfilling, or at least suited to fulfill, the role of a chess set. One plurality between T and T1, a second plurality between T1 and T2, and so on. This exists at a time provided that there's an appropriate descendant plurality suited to realise this role at that time. And it's located at a time where the members of that plurality are then. And I call these artificial continuants role collections. The conditions that successive realising pluralities constituting role collections should be appropriately related to an originating plurality and suited to fulfill the defining role R clearly introduces a degree of indeterminacy here. Strictly speaking, there are many distinct such artificial continuants, depending, for example, on how many, if any, of the originating plurality must be retained, and how far from actually realising R such pluralities may be. Third, we may approximate the contents of the box to a genuine natural continuant, that may survive both the loss with or without replacement of a part, and the failure to fulfill any salient or intended role. I may, in this sense, preserve the chess set before me, the one that my grandfather gave me, let's say, in spite of the fact that a pawn is destroyed and never replaced, and so it no longer fulfills the role of a chess set. Indeed, successive pawns may be destroyed each year until there are none left. Unified by approximation to a natural continuant, we may say that my grandfather's chess set nevertheless remains, much depleted and useless for playing with, as a collection of 16 back row pieces. A plastic chess set may even persist in this sense if all the pieces melt together into a single black and white lump, at which point the pretense of approximation becomes a reality. What results is indeed a single natural continuant. I call artificial continuants unified by approximation in this way, unsurprisingly, approximate natural continuants. Because this mode of grounding in general involves a degree of approximation, it's not possible to give precise existence and identity conditions for the artificial continuants involved. And surely it's the least salient artificial continuant to consider in the current case of a chess set. Nevertheless, there are many cases in which this third way of thinking seems to me apt to dominate. Still, once again, the need to distinguish clearly between genuine natural continuants and approximate natural continuants, which are artificial continuants, is absolutely crucial. So I turn now to a case of that kind. Consider, for example, a more robust assemblage of natural continuants, constructed for the purpose of fulfilling a specific salient function, such as the watch before me. This is the result of assembling a determinate plurality of distinct natural continuants for the purpose of fulfilling a specific timing role. And again, we can think in at least three ways about what's present. There are at least three distinct varieties of artificial continuants here. First, there's the simple plurality of precisely those n natural continuants that are currently assembled so as to fulfill the relevant role W. This is individuated by the identities of its members. As I said before, it exists at a time if and only if all n of those natural continuants exist, however dissembled and scattered, and its location at a time is where they are then. Second, there's a distinct role collection, or strictly speaking, many more or less similar role collections, consisting of a collection over time of pluralities of natural continuants, appropriately related to the original n watch components, and nearly continuously suited to play the watch role W. This artificial continuant may have some components replaced over time, may have many, may have all. It exists at a time provided that there's an appropriate descendant plurality suited to realize this role at the time. And it's located at a time where the members of that plurality are then. Third, though, we may also consider the watch as an approximate natural continuant, unified by the natural integrity and robustness of its material assembly, rather than by its particular component parts or its intended functional role. We assimilate or approximate it to a genuine natural continuant, unified both at a time and over time, independently of our concepts, activities, or interests. Unlike a simple plurality, this may lose parts. In this sense, the watch survives even if a part or parts are destroyed over time. Unlike a role collection, its persistence is quite independent of its suitability to play the watch role. Its lost parts may be absolutely essential to that role. It may get wet and fuse absolutely irreparably together with rust. It may even get so hot that the metal coalesces together. It may be then worn down gradually over time like a lucky coin, until all that remains is a small misshapen metallic lump. In this way, we consider its unity as more basic than any function of that of its natural continuant parts, either in terms of their individual identity and persistence, or in terms of their joint realization of any designated role. Although the approximate natural continuant conception may even dominate in cases such as this, I claim we must nevertheless strictly distinguish such artificial continuants, unified by their approximation to natural continuants, from genuine natural continuants themselves. The proponent of NCV sails, I admit, quite close to the wind here, but we may argue for this distinction by returning to the earlier discussion of spatial partition. There I established that a natural continuant O may not survive the loss of the complement P prime of a natural continuant proper part P. Now suppose for reductio that the watch before me is a genuine natural continuant. Suppose further that the final phase of its construction involves sticking a plastic logo onto its back surface. Let O be the finished watch, and P be its logoless proper part. So P prime is the logo attached to the back surface. Given the assumption that the finished watch is a natural continuant, it surely follows that P, that's to say the logoless proper part of the finished watch, is a natural continuant too. For both are equally assemblages of various parts for the purpose of fulfilling a function. Indeed, the final phase of construction may be highly unreliable. More watches leave the production line without their logo as with it. All are sold and serve their owners equally well. Furthermore, the completed watch may surely survive the loss of its stick-on logo, as natural continuants regularly survive the loss of their minor parts. But then we have a contradiction, for O has survived the loss of the complement P prime of a natural continuant proper part P. Thus our starting assumption that the watch really is a natural continuant must be rejected. Once again, it's crucial to respect the NCV distinction between genuine natural continuants and artificial continuants, even those unified by approximation to natural continuants. This argument involves sailing quite close to the wind, as I say, though, since the opponent of NCV may play it straight back against the NCV account of the way in which natural continuants such as Tibbles may survive the loss of a part, such as its tail. Put another way, the use of this argument in the case of artifact assemblages, such as my watch, challenges the proponent of NCV to clarify the key distinction between the two cases. What justifies the claim that Tib is a mere artificial continuant proper part grounded by spatial partition on its genuine natural continuant whole Tibbles, whereas my watch and its logoless proper part must be regarded as metaphysically on a par in such a way as to hold in place the claim that the watch is at best an artificial continuant that may be assimilated to a natural continuant only by approximation? And the simple reply is that Tibbles is absolutely not an assemblage of Tib and a tail in the way in which my watch is an assemblage of a logoless proper part and its stuck-on logo. Tib may only be unified top-down by spatial partition. The logoless proper part of my watch, on the other hand, exactly like the watch itself, is instead unified bottom-up by the assembly of its natural continuant parts for the purpose of fulfilling a designated role. In general, we see again that genuine natural continuants are absolutely not simple composites of any determinate collection of more basic natural continuant parts. They are, according to NCV, metaphysically fundamental. Okay, so I conclude in the final section 5 now with a very brief recapitulation of the main claims of NCV and a final contrast with the metaphysical vision of Quine. The central thesis of NCV is that there are, amongst the persisting macroscopic material objects that we perceive, natural continuants whose unity at a time and over time is entirely independent of our concepts and activities, and that ground artificial continuants by approximation, collection, and partition. Natural continuants satisfy exclusivity, but artificial continuants do not, either with natural continuants or amongst themselves. The abstract metaphysics of artificial continuants requires grounding in the basic domain of natural continuants, whose natural unity at a time and over time is brute, objective, and unanalysable, simple facts of the macroscopic material world. Failure to recognise this fundamental distinction between natural and artificial continuants causes significant error and confusion, I claim. As I say, I end now by contrasting very briefly this NCV perspective with the diametrically opposed vision of Quine. According to Quine, the metaphysically most basic material elements of our perceptual acquaintance are spatial parts of temporal parts of the familiar persisting objects that are effectively constructed from such elements by our judgments of identity and distinctness from different points of view over time. These are judgments that simultaneously define the various kinds into which the resultant material objects fall. Construed literally as judgments of numerical identity, these are all false. They're to be understood instead as assertions of co-membership of a set of spatio-temporal parts that effectively represents a persisting thing as it perjures through time. Thus, our practices of conceptual categorization articulate persisting macroscopic material objects out of a more basic domain provided by their perceptible spatio-temporal parts. According to NCV, on the other hand, the domain of our perceptual acquaintance with the material world includes natural continuants, whose unity at a time and over time is entirely independent of any concepts or activities on our part. Their arbitrary spatio-temporal parts and variously artificially unified composites are in part the work of our concepts and activities through various modes of abstraction. Our perceptual experience of the mind-independent world is fundamentally to be characterized as a continuous spatio-temporal perspective upon the natural continuants that are its metaphysically basic constituents. From the position of NCV, Quine's perjurantism is close to a form of idealism that attempts to give objective reality to these experiential perspectives. For NCV, enduring natural continuants are basic. Our experiences are fleeting, partial perspectives upon them, given our route through the world. Quine conversely attempts to make these fleeting glimpses basic and construct the world of persisting macroscopic material objects out of them. In this light, I recommend NCV to you all.
The format of these inaugurals does not have now a questions and answers period. However, I would like to really warmly invite all of you to come along to the wine reception at Chapters, where I'm sure Bill will be very happy to discuss informally this splendid lecture that he has just given over a glass of wine or apple juice, if you prefer. Before we do that, let me say a few words. So in my darkest moments as a head of department, which are not few, I make myself feel better by thinking that the department had the opportunity to appoint somebody of the stature of Bill Brewer. Bill, in the year and a bit, who has been our colleague at King's, has been a wonderful colleague. He has really poured energy and enthusiasm in all aspects of departmental life, especially that part of departmental life we care most about, its intellectual life, through very deep exchanges and conversation with students and colleagues. Of the many fine qualities which struck us about Bill when he was elected to the chair, I will mention his intellectual courage. Bill is not somebody who tinkers at the edges of an issue. When he sees a problem, he really doesn't let go until he has thought that through and comes up with bold, truly original, innovative proposals, as the one we heard tonight in this lecture about this view, the natural continuance view, and the grounding of artificial continuance. I'm sure we will hear a lot about that in future APA meetings and meetings of various associations and so on, because that is the sort of things Bill does. He really moves the debate in a new direction. He has done the same with his recently published book by OUP, the Perception and its Objects, which has now led as a development to this current project. The other side of this intellectual courage, I think, is intellectual honesty, because Bill is somebody who really faces objections, including his own objections to his own views, and he is somebody prepared even to move away from some of these views if they don't satisfy him fully any longer. So in short, Bill is another brilliant holder of the Susan Stebbing Chair, and it is a wonderful thing that we are here today to celebrate him. So come to chapters.